I put together for a short period of time that I did for Lake Erie College, so it's not proprietary to Lake Erie College, but it was designed to be a short course in evaluating your own saddle fit, because they wanted to be able to designate some students who helped other students figure out if the saddle that they selected for their lesson was working. So it kind of applies also if you're riding a multitude of horses, or you're leasing a horse, or you have a lesson program with school horses, because it's not always about finding the ideal perfect saddle for your one horse, although that's my favorite, but this is a reality conversation about saddle fitting. And fortunately, I asked for the horse to be back here, so I'm glad that really worked out well for Justin as well, because normally I do this talking about imaginary horse, so that would be helpful this time to actually be able to use one that we could talk about a little bit. So, in general, when we're talking about saddle fitting, the important things to first determine is what your overall horse looks like. Is he basically a stock horse, a warm blood, an off-the-track thoroughbred, or an off-the-track standardbred? Because they're all going to have the same anatomy, but different conformation. And the conformation that your horse has, you can wish upon a star, but the conformation that your horse has and the build that your horse has is pretty much the build that your horse has. So we can talk about ideal saddle fitting, or we can talk about practical saddle fitting. This is going to be a talk about practical saddle fitting. A lot of sport horses now have a rising back line. Actually, this little guy kind of has a rising back line. He's not sway back. He's not necessarily too high, but from the base of his withers, his back line starts to come up. And the only reason that that is important is that it is a factor in the shape of the saddle panel and the saddle tree that you use. If you use a really straight saddle on this horse, it's going to tend to have space here or bridging. If this horse excuse me, is really straight, and you use a saddle that has some bend in it and a panel that has some bend in it, you're always going to be working to make that saddle more stable. So it's easier if you have the option to start out with one that matches your horse's shape in the first place. Most of our sport horses now have, even though they're not direct crosses with thoroughbreds, most of them have some thoroughbred in their background. And that's something that has changed over the last several generations of horses, as particularly our sport horses have gotten to be a little less cold-blooded, and our hunters and jumpers are migrating a little bit more towards the warm bloods. And you see a lot of, used to be if you saw anything other than a thoroughbred in the hunter ring, the judge's notation was warm blood, wrong ring. Now there are a lot of warm bloods and warm blood crosses doing all sorts of jobs. Even for eventing, as they've gotten away from the traditional 4 phases where you had to go out and do roads and tracks, and warm bloods would die right there because they couldn't do roads and tracks, but the thoroughbreds excelled. As eventing has changed, so have a lot of the population of horses that do quite well in it. So it is important that you know enough about horse structure and anatomy to know that their engines are in the rear, their power comes from the hind legs up through the back and out the neck to, well, for my purposes, usually the bit. For those of you who were here for the previous discussion, in the direction of the bit, whether the bit is there or not. So as we are talking about structure, if you take this horse away and you had to do if you were playing, what is that game? Is it Pictogram? Pictogram, yeah. So if you were trying to get the picture of a horse, you could draw basically a suspension bridge with the front legs and the hind legs, a connection through it, the neck up, and a little bit of head. Most people, if they have a clue about horses, would say, that's a horse. So, is it the left one?
Left one.
The left one. Look at that. So, if you were a horse, you would be on all fours, obviously. And you would find that what is the shoulder for the horse is similar to the shoulder for you. the rib cage and the vertebrae along the thorax are the same as they are in the horse. You notice that the person has a little bit of an arch here compared to these very long spines that the horse has. So when you look at the top of the horse, it's not really the shoulder at the top of the horse. It's the spines and the vertebrae that make up the wither. Where your knees are, it's the horse's stifle. Where your heels are, you have the horse's hocks. And when you get down to the middle toe and the middle finger, that's the middle digit that's covered by the coffin bone that the horse is standing on. So what's the one difference here in the person versus here in the horse? What do you have that the horse does not have? The collarbone. The collarbone in a person is what connects your shoulder to the rest of your skeleton. The horse does not have that. This entire foreleg is connected to the horse through connective tissue, muscle, tendon, but no bone. So if you have a horse, for example, that is base narrow in front, that has an interference problem, and you say to the blacksmith, can't you just make him do this? No, the horse can't do that because he does not have the ability to do this with collarbone. So that's an important thing in saddle fitting. That's a big thing in advertising right now. It's shoulder freedom. We have girths for shoulder freedom. We have saddle pads for shoulder freedom. We have saddle construction for shoulder freedom. It is very important because if you pin the shoulder or you impede the motion of the shoulder because of your saddle placements or the way your saddle is constructed compared to the way your horse is constructed, if you stop this motion, you stop the whole foreleg of the horse. So, what's important? You have to know enough about the skeleton. You don't have to know everything about the skeleton, but you have to know enough about the skeleton to know what's critical underneath the skin. When I look at a horse, that's kind of the first thing I see is the skeleton. But for many people, they have no idea what's going on underneath the hood. And it's very important because there are 7 cervical vertebrae in the horse's neck, but they don't go along the top. It curves here. The last cervical vertebrae connects almost below the shoulder blade. So here, does anybody know how many pairs of ribs the horse has? Or how many thoracic vertebrae there are? What, 18? 7, 18. Then you get back into here, depending upon whether or not you believe that some breeds have less vertebrae through the lumbar area. It's either 5 or 6. I won't argue the point. It doesn't matter to me. But it is true with a short-backed horse. In theory, you could have 5, but most horses have 6 before you get back to the pelvis. And then you get back into the tailbone, and we don't care how many bones there are in there. But we do care here about these thoracic vertebrae because this is the area where the saddle can sit. Horses, unfortunately, were not made to carry us around. That goes back to that whole suspension bridge thing. So it is very important that we keep the saddle and we keep the rider on the strongest part of the back. If your horse's conformation is long and weak-backed, that's something that you need to consider in saddle fitting. If your horse is very straight, as I said, if your saddle has a lot of bend to it, then it's very difficult to keep it stable. And we want to keep it stable because, again, the horse is not made to carry us. Where it is best able to carry us is as close to the base of the wither as possible. So, I'll leave the PowerPoint for just a second and talk just for a minute about saddle trees. There are lots of different kinds of saddle trees in English saddles. This is a traditional version. It's layers of wood. It has spring steel. It has an iron head. This is what determines the width of your saddle. The shape of the saddle has to basically follow the contour of the horse, but then the panels are underneath it. So that is where you get the final shape. We could spend an entire day talking about different materials that are in saddles, and I'll pull that out in a second. This is a Pessoa tree. This is composite. It is some semblance of plastic. It still has the steel springs. It's a little more flexible. It's much lighter, but you'll see that it still has the head. This particular one has a changeable gullet so that you can change the width by taking this apart, which is, of course, another huge thing in English saddles. Many can have their width changed. Many can be changeable because you take the gullet out and put a new gullet in. The Toulouse saddles have a well-up system where you have two tools and you can make it from a narrow to an extra wide all in the same saddle. All of those are great as long as the basic shape of your saddle fits the horse. By the time you take the bones of the saddle to this tree and you make the entire saddle, in a jumping saddle, where this fits forward on the horse is not terribly important because it is the tree, which is in this little point pocket here. That's where the foremost part of your tree is. And the tree goes back to the back of the pen. In a dressage saddle, your flap is straighter, but the tree points are still in the same spot. When we are placing the saddle on a horse, we said that the top of the vertebrae are here. That's what forms the wither. The actual top of the scapula ends about here. So if we follow this point of the shoulder, you can see the line of the scapula here. It's shaped like that. And where we want to put the hard part of the saddle in the tree points is just behind that shoulder blade. So it won't be at the highest part of the wither. It won't be back here. It will be, this is the determining factor. So you have to palpate and find the back of the scapula, and then that's where you want the tree points, whether it's a jumping saddle or a dressage saddle, to sit. So if we put this on our horse, you see with the jumping saddle, that sits up over the shoulder. Again, this is soft, so that's not terribly important, but where the tree is here should sit just behind the shoulder. So when you're looking at your own horse, make sure, typically the problem that I see with jumping saddles is they want to put them up here. Questions so far? No. All right, so when you are looking at your saddle, the first thing that you have to look at is there clearance for the wither? Now you notice that this saddle has a silver nail here, and it has another one underneath. If you take those two lines, you're pretty much right on top of where the point pocket is. So that can be your external visual aid. When you're figuring out how far back the saddle is, typically it's going to be right underneath that nail, so that can help you figure out how far back it should be for the shoulder. Now, when you're looking at clearance for the wither, this fine specimen does not have a really long, high wither, but a lot of your horses do. So it's not so much whether you have clearance right at the front, it's whether you have clearance back here at the end. When you look at your saddle, you can see where the wither would fit underneath the head of the saddle. Some saddles are not so steep, some saddles are quite long in this distance, so the height and the length should approximately match your horse in height and length. How long is the length? The length is where the wither ends. So this distance from where you put the saddle tree and this distance, this spot here, that should be the length of the head, which should be the length that looks like this. So where the horse flattens out for the seat, the tree flattens out. Does that make sense? So if your saddle is this long and your horse is this long, you have a fitting problem. Better to have longer in height than too short, because if you put too much pressure here, what does your horse tend to do to you? Chuck you off. Make sense? All right. So, sufficient room where it counts. Back here, you should be able to fit. Rule of thumb is 2 fingers.
Talking 2 fingers this way or 2 fingers?
2 fingers height.
Oh, okay.
2 fingers this way. So not 2 fingers up here. I mean, if it doesn't have it here, it's definitely not going to have it further back.
Yeah.
But having clearance up here and having clearance back here are not necessarily the same thing.
So you have to stick them in.
So you have to put this. And it's almost, riders tell me all the time, well, I checked it. It's very difficult to do that. You either have to have somebody help you on the ground, or put the saddle on without pads, lightly girth it, then you get up and look in and see. And figure that depending upon the size of the rider, you're going to drop a little bit. Other factors that determine how much this drops, I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but I'm going to mention it, is what's inside your saddle. Is it foam? What's the quality of the foam? Is it flocked? You can have lots of arguments for many hours with people over which is better, foam or flocked. It depends, is the only answer. If you use one saddle on a lot of different horses, chances are it's better for you to have foam. Because one of the advantages of flocking is that it reshapes to the horse. The disadvantage of flocking is that it reshapes to the horse. So if you're using it on a lot of different horses, you don't get to have the advantage of the flocking, but it gets smushed down so that you have to reflock it. As long as you don't mind doing that, I think flocking is great. My saddle is on one horse. He's not growing anymore, so he's aging. So flocking works out really well for me. But if you use a saddle on a lot of different horses, you may be better off with a foam saddle. Does the fact that your saddle can have its tree width adjusted make it a universal fit? No, because if every horse you buy is basically the same conformation, your saddle will fit every horse. But if the only thing that you're doing is changing the width and the rest of the saddle does not fit, you've got a scoopy tree on a flat horse or a flat tree on a scoopy horse, the fact that you can make the width right is helpful, but it's not necessarily the answer. So it is a good thing. It's not necessarily the good thing. So, we talked a little bit about where the best place is on the horse's back. It's as close to the wither as possible. So it's behind the shoulder blade, but it's not back in the weaker part of the back. Ideally, as close to the wither as you can be is best. Whether the horse is standing still and his scapula is here, or he's over the top of a fence, the relative position of that scapula is not a significant change. Yes, it goes forward and back, but it's not going to move. I like that picture. So here, look at where the 7 cervical vertebrae actually are on this horse. It's not where you would think. How many people give their own shots to their horses, or have given a shot to a horse? Okay, that's why you're looking for this area and not where the vertebrae are. So when we're evaluating horses, or you're evaluating your own horse, there are lots of things that have an impact on your saddle fitting. Your horse's age, anytime he's got a significant change in his weight, either because the seasons change, he's on great pasture, or he's in mud, as we have now. How fit he is, if you've had a shoeing change, all of those things can have an impact on your saddle. Rarely does your saddle have an impact on shoeing, but shoeing can have an impact on your saddle fit. And that's why I think it's very important that everyone in your team, the owner, the trainer, your saddle fitter, the blacksmith, your dentist, your vet, all communicate. Communicating is not, well, there's a problem, obviously it's your saddle, or if I come out, there's a saddle problem, obviously it's your blacksmith. But communicating when there is a change in your horse, either in the change of his lifestyle or his job. If there's an obvious asymmetry left and right on his shoulders, either because he's had an injury, or particularly if you have a new horse, they are, as we are, not necessarily symmetrical. So if you have a shoulder that's larger on one side, then on the other side you will tend to have a concave area of the wither. Should you make your saddle fit that perfectly? Well, I don't know. Are you going to keep your horse asymmetrical all of his life, or you're going to work on making that more even? It depends on why it's there, but that's why there are so many therapeutic saddle pads. I'm a big believer in shimming something that's going to be temporary rather than trying to make the saddle work that way, because as it fills in, then your saddle is goofed up in the other direction. So my preference is to keep the saddles straight and then straighten the horse out with additional, if possible. When you're looking at a horse to purchase, if you already own him, then you look at the horse to notice the position of where the scapula is compared to the elbow. If the scapula and the elbow are really close together, then you end up buying really expensive girths because you have to keep that saddle back away. If the elbow is really close here, you have very little distance to work with. If you have a horse with a really well-sprung rib, like an Arab or a Morgan, sometimes they suffer from having a very small distance here where the girth can lie, versus the thoroughbred that may be very flat and have lots of room. So you can have a saddle here that whose billets here indicate that you're going to have this saddle back here. But if your horse's girth space and elbow are positioned here, then we have a problem. So either we're looking at a different saddle, or we're looking at a girth that modifies where that sits. There are many, many, many tools. We just have to look at the anatomy of the horse and the saddle that we're looking at and do the best job we can matching the two. If you are having a problem with your horse and you've looked at the back, one thing to look at also up here are the glands of the horse. Because if it can be a dental problem, it can be a chiropractic problem, it can be a saddle problem, it can be a hock problem, it can be a hoof problem, a navicular issue. Little telltale signs are swellings here, hard glands here, a horse that tips his head in work. All of those are little things, and we have to get to the bottom of it and figure out which part is causing our problem so we know which part to fix. Looking at your horse over the top tells you whether you have an asymmetry problem, whether the shoulders are here or here. Now, oftentimes I will ask people to give me a picture of the horse from the side and over the saddle area. Over on the side, I get great shots. Over the saddle area, I get, what about here? I can see exactly what his hips are doing, but nothing over there. So if you're going to do that, if you're going to bring pictures Or when you are doing what you should do a couple times a year is make an assessment of how your horse is looking. Take a picture this way, see if there's a weight change. Get up a little bit higher and take a picture this way so you can see the actual saddle area. If you want to come in and talk to me about a saddle fit on your horse, those are the things that will help the most. But whether you're looking for a saddle or not, those are good things to keep in your horse's file so that you know, well, I ride every day and I didn't notice this had happened, because it shows up every 6 months. Pressure points under the stirrup bars are another indication of a saddle fitting problem, a width problem. For example, if you see, yes, dirt on the saddle pad, yeah, that's tells you some. It can also, however, if you sit heavier on one side than the other, then you will tend to make your saddle pad sweatier and dirtier on that side. So yes, that is a tool we can use, but sometimes it's a tool that tells me more of how you ride rather than how your saddle sits. But that is one. Dirt on the saddle pad is one. Swelling under the stirrup bars is one for width. Absence of dirt or sweat on a pad that's otherwise clean can mean that there's too much pressure. Yes, it does help when you look at your horse's hips, if it's this way, or if your horse has scoliosis. Chances are you're not going to sell your horse, but they're all factors that need to be considered, whether it's in the padding, whether the saddle's flocked or not, the shape of the saddle, the shape of the panels. So your saddle placement here is just behind the scapula, right where that piece of tape is. If you have me out to do a full fitting and we're doing a tracing, then I usually mark with tape where the scapula is and then where I want the tree points to sit. And if we're ordering a saddle that is made to measure, then we'll do every 10 centimeters along the spine so that I can make a drawing that matches what your horse actually looks like.
You want the tree points right behind the scapula.
Want the tree points, find the back of the scapula. Back of the scapula is at the front of that masking tape. That's an inch masking tape, or about 2 fingers. You put the tree point right there. If your saddle is made in England, they tend to like it back a hair. If your saddle is made in Italy or France, they tend to like it right there. If your saddle is a copy of any of those other saddles, then I go with my 2 fingers. So, when you're looking for a saddle or when you go home and evaluate how your saddle fits, the distance from the scapula to the lowest point, that has to match fairly closely this. Now, you see how long this saddle is? Now compare that to that saddle. Okay? So, you can have height, you can have length. Typically with a horse, you want to have a little freedom on the sides so that your horse can bend easily, versus having, well, this is a medium wide saddle. So the way this one sits makes it very close here, and you'll feel that sometimes with your own saddle. That is not an ideal fit. You want to be able to have some room here. How many of you do carrot stretches with your horses? Everybody does carrot stretches in some way, shape, or form. So that, when you put your saddle on and girth it up, if you're not sure that your horse has enough room, do a carrot stretch and see if they have to do that to get around, because they don't have enough room here. So you should be able to fit fingers comfortably on each side of the wither. Your tree shape has to correspond to your top line. So that's flat back, or a lot of what is usually referred to as compensation. Distance from the height of the wither to the back. Some horses have very long spines, so you've got that much that you have to take up. So you either have to take it up with the saddle panel, an additional pad. A horse that is very close, if you put a lot of additional pads there, you can do that. You'll just feel like the Princess and the Pea up off the horse. Tree points should be fairly close to vertical. Why would you not want them to be here? Because it's got a better shot of impeding the motion of the shoulder. So you want the tree points to be fairly close to vertical. The panel shape, again, you want to have consistent panel here. When you put the saddle on without the girth, it's easier to show with this one. We started late, so. There it is. Put your saddle on. Make sure that it's far enough back in the tree points, just behind the scapula. Then put a little weight on the seat. Come up underneath the sweat flap and feel the contact along the spine. There should be no hard spots, no hard pressure spots, and no gaps. Should have a fairly consistent feel if you put a little bit of weight here from under the stirrup bar all the way to the cantle.
So you're putting your hand all the way in there, walking, and just kind of feeling it.
I'm sorry, what?
You're putting your hand just all the way in.
I'm putting my hand all the way up so that my fingertips are along the panel. Or, to show it another way, my fingertips are here.
Okay.
Okay? This is also important, the panel angle. If your horse has a flat back, he needs to have a fairly flat panel. If you have particularly a foam panel, which this is, now this one has a fairly rounded surface, but if this panel has no contact here and a lot of contact here, then it's not doing its job, because the panel's job is to spread force over a maximum surface area. So you will need to have about a hand's width between the panels. The panel should be consistent lengthwise and should be consistent in the angle here. You check that over looking at the top. I'm really picky about saddle pads, particularly shaped pads, but I don't like saddle pads. If your horse has shape, your saddle pad should have shape. If your horse is flat, then it can have just a cookie cutter flat pad. Your pad should be large enough so that the seam or the end of the pad is not underneath the panel, because that will create a ridge there. It's like having a fold in your sock. The first 5 minutes it's great. After an hour it's not so great. So your pad should be large enough to accommodate the entire size of your saddle. Shape of the head, we just talked about that, so you've got a little bit of comfortable space on either side. And clearance, length, and height, especially for a horse that has really long spines. Yes, there are therapeutic pads you can use to adjust that if you need to. Ideally, fix it with the saddle. If we can't be ideal, fix it with the pads. As I said, this is practical saddle fitting, not ideal saddle fitting. So the shape is more important than soft. Here you see, now if this horse were actually built this way, here's an example of a panel that has contact here but no support on the outside. And this horse, the panel angle is here, the panel angle is there, so it makes contact here to here, and it's consistent. When you're looking at your saddle, put it on, no pads, lightly girth it, step back, and look at it. Soft eyes, look at the whole picture. Does it look like it matches your horse? Or does it look like that? Is your eye drawn to this back contact? Now, it can be that your saddle is too far forward, or it can be that your saddle doesn't fit. If a good visual is if your eye goes to your saddle here, it's going to tend to push the stifle back, which will make it difficult for almost every discipline that you have, whether it's comfortable trail riding to jumpers, because it makes it difficult for the back to rise as the hind leg comes underneath. It makes for training difficulties, it makes for soundness difficulties, it makes for comfort for the riders difficulties. So here's one that I was working on a fitting, so I marked where the scapula is, I marked where the tree points are, and then I was doing a tracing, so I marked every 10 centimeters back. And then I took a saddle curve, so I marked along the spine, and then I bend it in half and marked it here, so I can do the wither and a little bit further back and a little bit further back. Sometimes you'll get one that's like that. That's when you have a shoulder asymmetry. In this particular horse's case, you see these rub marks, which is why I was called out, because obviously they had a horrible saddle fitting issue. Actually, the horse ended up having a thyroid issue, and it affected the hair coat. So every place things touched, this was not the saddle, this was friction rubs from saddle pad friction. So we looked at it, and here's a horse with a lot of compensation, a lot of height difference from here to his back. So he's one who needs a lot of pad or a lot of panel, and he's better off with a flocked panel because you can get more depth out of it usually than a foam panel. But he's a perfect example. He's not a perfect conformation horse. He's a little older, but in his particular case, I went out and looked at that horse a couple of weeks ago, and his back looks nothing like that now. In fact, we may have to do something different with his saddle. But in that case, it was a team effort because the hair coat just wasn't right, and his neck was a little crusty. So it turned out really to be primarily a thyroid issue. Sometimes I get horses to fit like this. This to me is a bad dream, but it's not a bad horse. He does his job, but he's definitely a challenge for saddle fit. No one makes a saddle that just fits that horse. And this horse is difficult because he doesn't have a lot of space behind his scapula, which is right here, and it comes right down to his elbow. So he doesn't have a lot of space that way. So these are challenges that we just kind of have to work with. When you're doing your saddle tracing, these are the pictures that I would like to see if you bring it in to say, this is my horse. I want to see the saddle area from the side. I want to see the saddle area from above. This particular horse, if you look at it, he's got a bigger shoulder here than here. Does everybody see that? The right is bigger than the left. Typically, behind a big shoulder, there's a hollow. And that hollow is what oftentimes makes your saddle rock left, right, or right, left. So that's one. Two, this horse, who is much more vertical and narrow than this horse, had a saddle that did not have much room on the sides of the withers, which is why after he was ridden, there was typically a swelling there. So those are things to look at if you're having behavior or training problems with your horse. Those are some of the telltale signs to look for. Is there a shoulder asymmetry that we can be fixing with a pad? Is the head too tight? Is there anything that's causing so much pressure that afterwards there's a little bit of edema there? So these are good things to observe while you're grooming. More? Okay, so what kind of things can you do for saddles that have problems? Well, you can use shims. I try not to use 3 on one side. That one was kind of drastic. But sometimes we have to deal with what we have to deal with. So if you have a horse that has an asymmetry problem, or you have a saddle that is a medium wide and a horse that is a medium, you have to get a new saddle. from my perspective, yes, because I want to come out and bring one. But from your perspective, no. But you have to be able to assess what's going on anatomically and in your fit, so we know what to use to make it best it is possible today. Which was kind of the basis of the Lake Erie College discussion, where they're dealing primarily with donated saddles and donated horses, and we're figuring out what to do that works best for the riders and best for the horses. Our time is up. Questions? Wow, I was really good. No, okay, I wasn't that good.
What do you recommend for like shimming? Like, do you like a pad that has like pockets in it, or like risers?
I really like correction pads so that you can put the shims in and not have to mess with it all the time. But if you have a temporary issue, or you're still trying to determine what your issue is, we have a lot of additional and replacement shims that, for the most part, particularly if you're using a square pad, will be polite enough to stay in one spot while you're figuring it out. But if it's going to be a long-term thing, I like correction pads. My personal, those are the ones that have the pockets in it. You know, and some of them have pockets in the front and back, and some of them have 3. There are all sorts of qualities and all sorts of. The pads are all well made, but the more expensive the pad, the longer the shims last, basically. But you can, you can get away with one that's, as long as it does the job. But if you ask me if the $69.95 shim pad is going to be identical to the $270 shim pad, I would have to say no. But it depends on why you're using it. If it's one that you've got several horses and every once in a while you're going to have to change the width on one, then you can get by with one that's not a problem. If you have one with a horse that has had a long-term injury, then I would suggest, I like, for fitting purposes, I like Mattis shims because they're very thin but they don't compress. If you have a long-term problem, or an older horse, or a horse with a really stiff gait and the rider has a back that's not quite as supple as it used to be, then the thin line ones are nice because they...
It would be more for a younger horse that's like underdeveloped, like in the wither area or across the back.
My personal favorite would be Mattis, but I could make anything work. With this one, this particular horse, he's kind of a poor thing. He has a combination of scoliosis, which is very noticeable, and he's off the track, and he had very... must be time to go.
Good night. Good night, I guess.
He has shoulder asymmetry and scoliosis. So, he's going to be one.
Before we go, we're going to do the drawing, right?
We're going to do the drawing.
We'll do a drawing real quick.
Yes. Okay.